Another point that I like to use in negotiating an M&A transaction is always volunteer to draft the documents. Always try to be the first one to the table with the document. Usually it's the buyer that negotiates the acquisition document. And usually their counsel is going to take the lead on that. But if you have the opportunity as a seller to do that, do it. So in some transactions, we've actually gone out in an auction process, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, what that means and how it works. We've gone out to prospective buyers and we said, look, here is our letter of intent. Oh, and by the way, here is our merger or our purchase agreement that we would like to see you use. And it has a variety of things in it that we'll talk about in a little bit that we want to have in our transaction. And so you've sort of taken the first step at drafting the document. If the buyer comes back and says, no, we're not going to use your form, we're going to use our document, and that's the only way we're going to do the deal. But if you get another buyer out there who's willing to offer the same amount for the same type of consideration, for the same, and all other factors are equal, and they'll say, yeah, we'll start with your document, and they don't completely eviscerate it and replace it with their document, then who would you choose when you're negotiating potential prospective partner, prospective buyer? Tim, who would you choose if you're going to, negotiate this deal?
That's easy if they accept my document, no doubt.
Okay.
Not all money's the same.
Not all money is the same. That's right. Timing is critical in a transaction. Timing in negotiation is critical. When do you bring up the big issue? When do you bring up the point that has been bothering the seller since the very beginning, but nobody's mentioned it? The elephant in the room, the non-compete agreement, or the employment agreement, or the earn-out, and how the earn-out is going to be structured. When do you bring it up? It's all part of the negotiation. It's all part of experience in negotiating. And then other things. There are different ways of negotiating. And just suffice it to say, the Cro-Magnon threat, fit, pound the fist on the table, get everybody up and walk out of the room strategy is not my favorite strategy at the point. And I don't think it works. I don't think it's a good strategy, because you can maybe do that once and there may be a justifiable reason to do it. But if you do it all the time, or you get a reputation as doing it, then people in the community, in the merger and acquisition community, will know that through the investment banking community, through valuation experts, through others who've been through transactions. You see that guy Zell? He got up and just pounded his fist on the table, told his client to walk out of the room. I don't know if we should use him on the next transaction. So these are, there are techniques that we use in negotiating, but the best way, I think, to negotiate is to understand really the 4 precepts of negotiation. Who has the leverage in the deal? Leverage meaning who really can influence the playing field. So if Helen, in our example, is a really sought-after company, her ABC company is a sought-after company, and in an auction process run by her investment banker, she finds that there are 5 or 6 companies or 5 or 6 buyers that might be willing to purchase, then she may have some leverage in negotiating because she's really sought after, and she doesn't necessarily need to go with the first buyer that she picks. So she may end up seeing how people are going to lay out the terms and the structure of the deal in letters of intent that are offered to her, and she may have discussions with the buyers through her investment banker and the prospective buyers, and she may realize that she's got significant leverage on a variety of points. And I've seen this over the years, particularly when an M&A market is really hot. If it's a seller's market, it makes it easier. You have more leverage. If you've got something that the buyer really wants in the form of a product or a contract or employees or products or technology, that gives you leverage to negotiate. Also, when you're negotiating, the more information you have about what the buyer wants and what the seller wants and what they don't want, the easier it is to negotiate. So if somebody says, well, we don't do that in our transactions, or we don't put that in our typical purchase document, your response should be, well, in this instance, we're concerned about this particular provision because it's going to affect us this way. And so having that information to be able to parlay back to the buyer allows you to get the buyer to understand your position, and maybe we can tailor a provision that satisfies the seller's concerns. So information. Credibility. Knowing when somebody's bluffing and knowing when somebody's BSing is really an important skill. Good negotiators can see that, but also knowing when somebody's really sincere and seeing behind the discussion and the information is very important to be able to do. And then judgment, striking a balance between trying to win your point and compromising. And this is really a problem I see with a lot of lawyers out there. They love to win every argument because we're trained to do that, right? We're trained in law school, we're trained in our practice to do that. Investment bankers, many of them are the same way. Really the best investment bankers and the best lawyers are the ones that know how to reach a compromise, that know how to see through what the party's concerns are and then tailor it to everybody's particular issues. So develop a game plan. Always know what you want before you start the negotiations. Where do you start on a particular issue? When do you move your chess piece? And then how do you close on the issue? So when you're structuring a deal, there are different structures that we use. And this would be the slide marked structures: asset purchases, stock purchases, mergers, hybrids. And it all depends on who's doing the buying, what the structure of the seller is, and what your ultimate objective is. So in an asset purchase, the buyer is looking to cherry pick assets of the seller. They can limit what the seller is selling to them, and they can limit exposure to unwanted liabilities by using an asset purchase. But the asset purchase is significantly complicated for a government contractor like Helen. Why? Because she's got contracts. And in the government contracting world, every contract would have to be novated. And novations with government agencies are extremely difficult these days, particularly in today's environment. So an asset purchase is not the way we typically go with a government contractor. It's extremely rare. The only time we'll use an asset purchase is when we are buying a contract or two from a particular client. Asset purchases and other deals may be essential, but we usually try to do some form of a stock purchase. So if I'm the owner of the business and I own stock, I want to sell that stock because that represents the entire ownership interest and the entire business. I don't want to keep anything. I don't want to keep any of the liabilities. I don't want to keep any of the assets. Here, take the whole thing. So I'm going to sell my stock to you. Now, even in that instance, the buyer may say, well, I don't want this division, I don't want this asset. You have to keep the liabilities, or you have to pay off the liabilities, which usually happens in a transaction. The liabilities usually have to be extinguished at closing. Now, we may use the purchase price to help extinguish it. We may use some of our existing cash to pay down our line of credit or our liabilities. If we've got shareholder or employee liabilities, the buyer doesn't want that stuff. But if I sell stock in a straight stock sale, I get long-term capital gain if I've held the stock for more than a year. And in some instances, I may actually get a complete exclusion from tax under this section 1202, which one of my clients just recently utilized. Quick aside on that, if you're a C corporation, not an S corporation, and you meet certain criteria, or you're not too big, you're a qualified small business, and you sell the stock in a transaction, under today's law, you can exclude 100% of the gain and not pay any tax on the transaction. That is a reason to be structured as a C Corp. But usually people don't structure their businesses as C Corps today. Most of them are S corporations or LLCs taxed as S Corps or partnerships. And so what we want to do is we want to be able to sell our stock and generate the lowest possible tax for the seller as we can. But what does the buyer want? The buyer wants to buy the business and get a write-off for it. If they bought the stock and they didn't do anything else, they wouldn't get a tax write-off for it. They wouldn't get a tax write-off for it. because they're buying the stock, they're not buying the assets. So there are tax structures that we use, and we're going to actually explore one in one of your handouts in a second. Tax structures that we use to get the buyer what the buyer wants, to be able to write up goodwill and write it off over 15 years. That's a valuable asset for them, the tax benefit of the write-off of the goodwill. So they want to be able to do that. And the seller is willing to compromise as long as they get compensated for the additional tax that they have to pay as a result of that. So we have this thing called the 338H10 election, which applies to acquisitions of S corporations. So if we have a big company that comes in and says, you know, I want to buy Helen's stock. I do want to buy her stock, but I want to get a write-up for the goodwill and the other assets that I'm buying. And I want to be able to write them off in the future after the acquisition is over. I want the seller to agree to have us make this election under the Internal Revenue Code. And that will treat, for tax purposes only, the transaction as an asset sale followed by a distribution to the shareholders.